The monitors in the private suite of the Vane Medical Center hummed with a rhythmic, mechanical indifference, a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension in the room. Silas Vane, the man who had spent 40 years commanding the tides of global commerce, lay tethered to a nest of tubes and wires. At 70, his face was a map of hard-won victories and ruthless decisions. But now, beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, he looked fragile, a fallen titan carved from pale wax. The stroke had been a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It had struck him during the keynote speech of the Vane Shipping Empire's Platinum Jubilee, just as he was about to announce a new era of expansion. One moment, he was the sun around which the industry orbited. The next, he was a captive of his own failing nerves. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the city skyline he had helped shape, was Lyra. To the world, she was the steel Orchid, his brilliant, devoted eldest daughter and the heir apparent. She had his obsidian eyes and the same predatory grace that had made the Vane name feared in boardrooms from London to Singapore. For the last 48 hours, she hadn't left his side. She had personally vetted every nurse, whispered encouragement into his ear when he drifted into consciousness, and held his hand with a grip that felt like a lifeline. Silas struggled to focus. His vision was a blurred mosaic of white and gray, but he could feel the weight of the document resting on his lap. It was a dormant power of attorney and a full executive transfer. His legal team had drafted it months ago as a break glass in case of emergency measure. With his signature, or even a witnessed mark of intent, Lyra would become the living embodiment of his will. She would hold the keys to the fleet, the offshore accounts, and the thousands of lives that depended on the Vane paycheck. "Father," Lyra whispered, her voice a soothing balm that seemed to cut through the fog in his brain. She moved from the window to the bedside, her footsteps silent on the linoleum. She leaned over him, her face inches from his. "The board is circling like sharks. They see your silence as a weakness. They want to dismantle everything you built, piece by piece, ship by ship." Silas tried to speak, but his tongue felt like a heavy, foreign object in his mouth. A dry rasp was all he could manage. He looked at her, searching for the reflection of the love he had poured into her. He remembered her as a little girl, tracing trade routes on his mahogany desk with a tiny finger. He had raised her to be a conqueror because he believed she was the only one worthy of his legacy. "I need to protect it for you," she continued, her thumb gently stroking the back of his hand. "I need the authority to shut them down. One signature, and the Vane name stays whole. Just one mark, and I will be your hands while you find your strength again." She held up a heavy gold fountain pen, the same one he had used to sign the merger that had crushed his last major rival 30 years ago. Slowly, with an effort that felt like lifting a mountain, Silas moved his right hand. His fingers fumbled, weak and trembling, but Lyra was there to steady him. She guided his hand toward the parchment. In his mind, Silas saw the faces of his captains, the vast steel hulls of his tankers, and the eyes of his wife, Elena, who sat weeping in the waiting room. He felt a surge of paternal pride. Even in his darkest hour, he had a successor who was ready to fight. He pressed the nib to the paper. The ink bled into the grain, a dark, permanent stain that transferred his life's work into her palms. As soon as the final stroke was completed, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a tightening of Lyra's shoulders, a change in the way she stood. She didn't pull away immediately. She stayed there, leaning over him, but the warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that Silas didn't recognize. The nurse, who had been standing by the door as a witness, took the document and slipped out of the room without a word. The door clicked shut, leaving them in a silence broken only by the hiss of the ventilator. Lyra reached up and adjusted the flow of his foredrip, her movements clinical and precise. She didn't look like a grieving daughter anymore. She looked like a victor inspecting a battlefield. "You always told me that a great captain knows when to go down with his ship," she said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic hum that vibrated in the stillness. "But you were wrong about one thing, Silas. You thought the ship was the company. You thought the ship was the money." She leaned closer, her lips brushing against the shell of his ear. Silas felt a cold shiver go down his spine that had nothing to do with the hospital air. He tried to pull his hand back, but her grip was now a vice, pinning him to the bed. "The ship was you," she whispered. And you've been sinking for a long, long time. You were so busy looking at the horizon that you never noticed the leak right next to you. You were so proud of my killer instinct. You spent 20 years sharpening me, honing me into the perfect weapon. She paused, a small, cruel smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Silas's heart rate monitor began to beep faster, a frantic staccato that filled the room. His eyes widened, searching hers for a hint of a joke, a lapse in sanity. Anything but the absolute, chilling truth he saw there. You just didn't realize who I learned to kill for, she said, her voice devoid of any emotion other than a dark, simmering triumph. Every lesson you taught me, every rival you showed me how to crush, I was practicing on you. This isn't your recovery, Silas. This is your retirement. And trust me, it's going to be a very, very quiet one. She reached up and turned a dial on the monitor, silencing the alarm that was signaling his rising distress. She smoothed the hair back from his forehead with a terrifying tenderness, a gesture that looked like a blessing but felt like a shroud. Don't fight the sedation, she murmured, moving toward the door. The doctors say you need your rest, and you have so much of it ahead of you. As the heavy door swung shut behind her, Silas was left alone in the dim light. The room that had felt like a sanctuary moments ago now felt like a tomb. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had just signed away his soul, and realized with a sickening horror that the predator he had raised hadn't just taken his chair. She had been waiting her whole life to watch him drown. The door had barely latched shut when the silence of the hospital room was invaded by a new presence. Elena Vane, Silas's wife of 40 years, stepped out from behind the heavy privacy curtain. There were no tears on her face. The grieving mask she had worn in the hallway had been discarded, revealing a woman whose features were as sharp and predatory as Lyra's. Following closely behind her was a man Silas hadn't seen in 3 decades, a ghost from his darkest chapter, Victor Thorne. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs, the monitor's frantic pulse silenced, but its light flashing a rhythmic, crimson warning. Victor Thorne looked older, his hair a shock of silver, but his eyes still held the same smoldering hatred from the day Silas had systematically dismantled Thorne's shipping firm, bankrupting his family and driving him into a disgraceful exile. Look at him, Victor, Elena said, her voice devoid of the warmth Silas had cherished for half his life. She walked to the foot of the bed, her hand resting on the railing with a casual possessiveness. The great Silas Vane, reduced to a shivering heap of meat and memories. Victor approached the bedside, his gaze raking over Silas with a mixture of disgust and profound satisfaction. 30 years, Silas. 30 years I spent in the shadows, watching you build your towers on the ruins of my life. You thought you were a genius. You thought you were untouchable. But you were just a man who forgot to check his own foundation. Silas struggled to draw a breath, his lungs feeling like they were filled with wet sand. He looked at Elena, his eyes pleading for a reason, a sign that this was a nightmare. Don't look at me like that, Silas, Elena snapped, her voice cold. I never loved you. I was the debt Victor paid to ensure your downfall. I was the poison you invited into your bed, the spy who whispered your secrets into the phone while you slept. Every move you made, every merger you planned, Victor knew it before the ink was dry. Lyra stepped forward, standing between Elena and Victor. The resemblance was no longer just a matter of shared ambition. It was physical. The way she tilted her head, the specific curve of her jaw. It wasn't Silas she mirrored. It was the man standing beside her. The DNA results came back yesterday, though Mother and I have known the truth for a long time, Lyra said, her voice steady and cruel. You spent 30 years raising me, Silas. You gave me the best tutors, the best schools, the finest lessons in ruthlessness. You poured your soul into me, thinking you were securing your bloodline. But you were just training Victor's daughter to take back what you stole from him. The revelation hit Silas harder than the stroke ever could. The daughter he had adored, the child he had held in the delivery room, the girl he had taught to sail under the summer sun. She was the living embodiment of his greatest enemy's revenge. He had nurtured the very blade that was now plunged into his heart. Victor reached out and took Elena's hand, a gesture of intimacy that felt like a physical blow to Silas. You destroyed my company, so I took your family. You stole my future, so I stole your legacy. Lyra is the finest weapon ever forged, Silas. And the best part? You forged her yourself. The transfer you just signed isn't just a power of attorney, Lyra added, stepping closer to the bedside. It's a bridge. By tomorrow morning, Vane shipping will no longer exist. It will be absorbed by Thorn Holdings. Every ship, every dock, every offshore account will be wiped clean of the Vane name. You will be erased, Silas. Not just from the business world, but from history. Silas felt a tear track through the stubble on his cheek. He was trapped in a paralyzed body, forced to listen to the architects of his ruin. He tried to move his hand, to reach for the call button, but Lyra noticed. She gently picked up his hand and placed it back on the bed, patting it with a mock tenderness that made him want to scream. The doctors are going to tell the world that your condition has worsened, Elena said, her voice smooth and rehearsed. A secondary stroke. Sudden, tragic, and utterly debilitating. You won't be able to speak, Silas. You won't be able to write. You'll just be a silent witness to your own funeral while you're still breathing. Victor leaned down, his face inches from Silas's. The smell of expensive cologne and old resentment filled Silas's senses. I'm going to sit in your office, Silas. I'm going to sleep in your bed. I'm going to walk through your gardens with the woman you thought was yours. And when I'm bored of that, I'll watch your daughter, my daughter, dismantle every last stone of the fortress you built. Lyra walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. We've already arranged for your transfer. A private facility. Very exclusive. Very remote. They specialize in patients who have lost touch with reality. No visitors. No phones. No hope. She turned back to him, her face illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the hospital glass. You taught me that in this world, there are predators and there are prey. You spent 70 years being the predator, Silas. It's time you learn what it feels like to be hunted. The three of them stood there for a moment, a tableau of betrayal. Silas looked from his wife to his rival, and finally to the girl he had called his daughter. He realized then that his life had been a meticulously constructed illusion. Every hug, every "I love you," every shared triumph had been a calculated step toward this moment. Goodbye, Silas, Elena said, turning toward the door. Try not to think too much. It only makes the time pass slower. Victor followed her, pausing at the door to give Silas one final, mocking salute. Lyra lingered for a second longer. She reached over and turned off the overhead light, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness, broken only by the dim, green glow of the silent heart monitor. Rest now, Father, she whispered, the word dripping with irony. The Empire is in good hands. As the door clicked shut, the darkness seemed to press down on Silas's chest. He was alone in the silence, a king without a throne, a father without a child, a man buried alive in the wreckage of his own pride. The hum of the hospital was gone, replaced by the roar of the ocean in his ears, the sound of his world sinking into the abyss, led by the very person he had taught to navigate the storms. He closed his eyes, but there was no escape from the haunting image of Lyra's smile, a smile he had created, now turned into a tombstone for everything he had ever loved. The ambulance ride was a blur of rain-slicked windows and the rhythmic, hollow wail of a siren that Silas knew was not meant to save him, but to bury him. He was no longer a patient. He was cargo. By the time the wheels stopped humming, the city's glowing arteries had been replaced by the oppressive silence of the countryside. The Grey Oaks was not a hospital. It was a fortress of Victorian stone and modern steel, hidden behind a perimeter of electrified wire and ancient, weeping oaks. As the orderly slid his stretcher out, the air was sharp with the scent of pine and salt, the smell of the coast, but without the freedom of the open sea. Silas looked up at the monolithic structure, and for the first time in his life, the man who had designed skyscrapers felt crushed by the weight of a building. The transition was surgical. There was no intake interview, no consultation with a sympathetic doctor. Instead, Silas was wheeled through a series of pressurized doors that hissed shut with finality. The interior was a nightmare of sterile perfection, monochrome walls, recessed lighting that cast no shadows, and a floor so polished it looked like black ice. Subject 402. A voice crackled over an intercom. It wasn't a name. It was a filing code. He was stripped of his silk hospital gown and dressed in a coarse, gray tunic. Every movement was a struggle. His left side still lagged behind his brain's commands, a physical manifestation of his betrayal. Two towering orderlies with faces like granite lifted him into a wheelchair and pushed him down a corridor that seemed to stretch into infinity. "Where am I?" Silas managed to rasp, the words clawing their way out of his throat. The orderly on the right didn't look down. "You're in the quiet zone, Mr. Vane. Somewhere your paranoia won't hurt anyone." They reached a heavy, reinforced door at the end of the hall. It opened into a room that was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It was a padded suite, but not in the way the movies depicted. It was elegant, cold, and entirely devoid of sharp edges or personal identity. There were no windows, only a high-definition screen on the wall displaying a looped video of a calm forest. To a stranger, it might look like luxury. To Silas, who understood the architecture of confinement, it was a tomb designed to keep the occupant from ever feeling the sun again. For the first few days, time became an abstract concept. The lights never fully dimmed, maintaining a perpetual, artificial twilight that eroded his sense of day and night. Meals arrived through a slot in the door, bland, soft foods that required no utensils. There were no newspapers, no books, and the television screen refused to change from its haunting, silent forest. The true cruelty, however, was the therapy. Once a day, a man in a pristine white coat would enter. He introduced himself as Dr. Eris, but he never looked Silas in the eye. He would sit by the bed, a tablet in hand, and read aloud reports of Silas's supposed decline. "Your daughter called today, Silas," Eris would say, his voice a flat, rehearsed monotone. "She's very concerned. She says you've started inventing stories about a man named Victor Thorne. She's worried the stroke has induced a permanent state of hallucinatory psychosis." Silas tried to roar, to grab the man by the throat and tell him that Thorne was real, that the betrayal was documented, but his body betrayed him. His protests came out as slurred, desperate whimpers. "See," Eris would sigh, tapping his screen. "Agitation, confusion. It's for the best that we increase your sedation." The medication was a heavy, sweet syrup that made his thoughts feel like they were mired in tar. It was designed to keep him in a state of compliant lethargy, a living ghost. Lyra hadn't just imprisoned him. She was gaslighting his very existence. She was using the legal system he had mastered to prove that his truth was merely a symptom of a broken mind. One evening, or perhaps it was morning, Silas sat in his wheelchair, staring at the digital forest. He felt the darkness closing in, the terrifying urge to just let go and succumb to the fog. If he stopped fighting, the pain of the betrayal would stop. He could just be Subject 402 until his heart finally gave up. But then, he noticed something. The high-definition screen flickered. For a fraction of a second, the lush green leaves of the digital forest shifted into a series of jagged, geometric lines. It was a glitch in the refresh rate. To anyone else, it would be a minor technical error. But to Silas Vane, it was a revelation. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. He knew the system. He had commissioned a similar interface for the Vane corporate headquarters 5 years ago. It was a closed-loop security network designed by a firm he had once bailed out of bankruptcy. He knew the structural vulnerabilities of this building because he was the one who had pioneered the invisible cage concept for high-end security. The Grey Oaks was a fortress of his own ideological making. He had once believed that total control was the ultimate form of safety. Now, he was the victim of his own philosophy. He looked at the vent in the ceiling, the seam of the reinforced door, and the specific placement of the motion sensors. Every inch of this room was designed to monitor his physical presence, but it wasn't designed to monitor a mind that was waking up. The betrayal of his blood had shattered his heart, but it had also stripped away his distractions. He no longer had a company to run or a family to please. He had only one mission: survival. As the heavy sedation began to wear off that night, he had learned to tuck the syrup under his tongue and spit it into the sink later. Silas felt a cold, sharp spark of his old self return. He wasn't just a shipping magnate. He was an architect. And architects knew that no matter how solid a wall looked, it always had a seam. No matter how deep a vault was, it always had an air duct. Lyra thought she had put him in a cage. What she didn't realize was that she had put him in a classroom. He would study the guards, the schedule, and the very wires that hummed in the walls. He would wait for the moment the machine faltered. He stared at the digital forest on the wall, but he no longer saw trees. He saw a grid. He saw a sequence of code. He saw a way out. "You should have killed me, Lyra," he whispered into the empty, sterile room. His voice was still gravelly, but the slur was gone. His eyes, once clouded with tears, were now as hard as the obsidian they had once been compared to. "Because as long as I'm breathing, I'm building." Outside, the wind howled through the ancient oaks, but inside, the silence was no longer a weight. It was a weapon. Silas Vane, Subject 402, began to count the seconds between the guard's footsteps, beginning the long, meticulous process of deconstructing his own prison. Weeks turned into a monotonous cycle of white walls and artificial twilight. But within the silent confines of Subject 402's room, a different kind of architecture was being drafted. Silas Vane had stopped being a victim the moment he realized that the Grey Oaks was a machine, and every machine had a pulse. He began by mapping the invisible. He spent hours with his ear pressed against the cold floor, learning the vibration of the facility's plumbing and the hum of the electrical conduits. He learned that the heavy steel door to his suite cycled its magnetic lock every 6 hours for a diagnostic microsecond, a flaw in the security software he had seen once before in a shipyard in Rotterdam. He learned that the air filtration system surged at 3 a.m., creating a localized vacuum that rattled the vent in the ceiling. But the most critical component of his escape wasn't a wire or a bolt. It was a human being. Elias was a man who looked like he had been carved from the very oaks that surrounded the facility. He was a janitor, a ghost in a blue jumpsuit who moved through the corridors with a heavy, limping gait. For the first month, Elias had ignored Silas entirely, mopping the floors with a stoic, downward gaze. He was part of the furniture, a man paid to be invisible. One Tuesday, while Elias was buffing the floor outside the suite, a tray of medication was pushed through the slot. Silas didn't take it. Instead, he waited until the shadow of the janitor's boots appeared under the door. "The hydraulic press on the 3rd floor," Silas said, his voice a low, raspy command that barely carried over the hum of the floor buffer. "It's dragging. If you don't grease the left piston, it's going to blow a seal by morning." The buffer stopped. The shadow under the door remained perfectly still. After a long minute, the machine started back up, and the shadow moved on. The next day, Elias returned. This time, when he mopped near Silas's door, he lingered. He didn't speak, but he tapped a rhythmic code against the metal frame, a signal Silas recognized from his days in the Merchant Marines. It was a simple question. "Who are you?" Silas positioned himself by the door, speaking through the gap of the meal slot. 30 years ago, a man named Elias Vance was trapped under a shipping container at Pier 14. The owner of the line refused to wait for the fire department. He climbed into a forklift himself and held the wait for 40 minutes until the paramedics arrived. He broke 3 ribs and a wrist, but he didn't let go. A long, heavy silence followed. Then, a muffled voice, thick with gravel and age, whispered back, "That man didn't just save my legs, Mr. Vane. He paid for my daughter's surgery when the insurance company walked away." The alliance was forged in that moment, a debt of blood and steel that Lyra's money could never buy. Elias became Silas's eyes and ears. He began to leave small gifts hidden in the folds of the fresh linens, a stub of a pencil, a scrap of a newspaper, and eventually, the ultimate prize, a discarded, cracked screen tablet that had been tossed in the facility's recycling bin. Using the tablet and the facility's internal Wi-Fi, which Elias provided the password for after cleaning the administrative wing, Silas began to haunt his own empire. He had to be careful. He couldn't log into his main accounts without alerting Lyra's cybersecurity team. Instead, he accessed the ghost keys. Years ago, paranoid of a hostile takeover or a digital blackout, Silas had installed a deep-layered backdoor in the Vane shipping global tracking system. It was an analog-coded override hidden within the ballast control software of his oldest tankers. To the world, these ships were nearing retirement. But to Silas, they were his Trojan horses. From his padded room, Silas watched the digital map of the world. He saw his fleet, his life's work, moving in strange, erratic patterns. Lyra wasn't just running the company. She was cannibalizing it. He watched as 3 of his largest grain carriers changed their transponder codes in the middle of the Atlantic, vanishing from public view. They were being used for Thorne's smuggling operations, moving dark cargo between unsanctioned ports. "She's burning the house down to keep herself warm," Silas whispered to the glowing screen. Every night, Elias brought more information. Lyra had moved Victor Thorne into the Vane estate. They were planning a legacy gala in 2 weeks to announce the total dissolution of Vane Shipping and the birth of Thorne Vane International. It was to be a victory lap, a public execution of Silas's name. "They think you're dead in here, sir," Elias whispered one night through the slot. "The staff, they're talking. There's a new order. After the gala, they're moving you to the permanent care wing. High sedation. No more visitors. Not even me." Silas felt the cold hand of the clock ticking against his neck. He had 14 days to turn his prison into a command center. He began to use the tablet to send ghost signals. He didn't send emails. He sent microscopic glitches. A 5-minute delay in a docking sequence in Singapore. A sudden, unexplained pressure drop in the fuel lines of a tanker in the Mediterranean. A ghost flickering on the security cameras of the Vane boardroom. He was waking up his loyalists, the old captains, and the veteran engineers who knew the Vane touch. He was letting them know that the captain wasn't dead. He was just navigating through a fog. The physical toll was immense. Silas spent his nights exercising in the dark, pushing his recovering body to its limits. He practiced walking without a limp, using the tension of his own muscles to bridge the gap left by the stroke. He spent his days playing the part of the broken, drugged-out Subject 402, staring vacantly at the digital forest on the wall while his mind was calculating the exact torque required to snap the magnetic lock on his door. One evening, Elias slipped a final item through the slot. It was a burner phone with a single contact saved. "I found him," Elias whispered. "The man who handled your private security before the steel Orchid fired everyone. He's been looking for you, Silas." He never believed the dementia story. Silas took the phone, his fingers steady and strong. He looked at the digital forest on his wall one last time. The trees were still fake, the light was still artificial, and the walls were still thick. But for the first time since the stroke, Silas Vane didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a predator. He dialed the number. When a gruff, familiar voice answered on the other end, Silas didn't ask for help. He gave an order. "This is the captain," Silas said, his voice cold and sharp as a winter sea. "Prepare for a boarding party. We have a ship to take back." The hook was set. The machine was humming. And in the heart of the gray oaks, the ghost in the room had finally found his voice. Lyra had taught him how to be a killer, but she had forgotten that he was the one who had built the world she was trying to steal. And Silas Vane was about to show her that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous architect of all. The digital backdoor Silas had carved into his empire years ago was not a glowing portal or a grand cinematic interface. It was a ghost in the code, a series of dormant commands buried within the mundane ballast control systems of the Vane fleet. From the cracked screen of the smuggled tablet, Silas watched the world in flickering lines of green text. He was no longer a man in a padded cell. He was a titan reaching across oceans from a tomb. The first step of his strike was not about power, but about chaos. Silas knew that Lyra and Victor Thorne were meticulous, but they were also arrogant. They assumed the old man was a vegetable, a discarded relic. They had stopped monitoring the internal heartbeat protocols of the older tankers, the ones Silas had personally engineered. With a few precise keystrokes, Silas triggered a phantom pressure event in the Vane Aurora, a massive crude carrier currently navigating the Strait of Malacca. On the bridge of that ship, alarms began to wail. The automated systems reported a catastrophic failure in the hull integrity, a lie Silas had programmed decades ago as a dead man's switch. The ship's captain, an old-timer named Holloway who had served Silas for 30 years, recognized the specific frequency of the alarm. It wasn't a standard emergency. It was a signal. Halfway across the world, in the high-tech war room of the Vane corporate headquarters, Lyra was alerted to the crisis. Silas watched through the hijacked security feed of the boardroom. He saw her face, pale, tight, and frustrated. She was losing control of a ship she didn't understand. She barked orders to her new engineers, but they were Thorne's men, experts in finance and smuggling, not in the gritty, analog reality of heavy shipping. They were helpless against the ghost keys. "You built the house, Lyra," Silas whispered to the dark room, his eyes reflecting the green glow of the tablet. "But I built the locks." While Lyra was distracted by the Aurora, Silas turned his attention to the financial heart of the betrayal. He knew that Victor Thorne was using Vane shipping to launder offshore funds into a new shell company called Thorne Vane International. They were moving hundreds of millions through a series of dark ports, unlisted docks Silas had mapped out during the chaotic trade wars of the 90s. Using the janitor's burner phone, Silas contacted the only man he still trusted, Marcus Reed, his former head of security. Reed had been living in hiding since Lyra fired him, knowing too much about the Steel Orchid's rise to power. "Captain." Reed's voice was a low growl, thick with disbelief. "I need the vault, Marcus," Silas said, his voice now a rasping blade of its former self. "The physical one, in the basement of the old dockyard office. The digital transfer Lyra signed is a forgery of intent, but the physical titles to the fleet were never moved. They're still in the sublevel safe. They have guards everywhere, Silas," Reed warned. "And the facility you're in, it's a black hole." "The guards are paid by the hour," Silas countered. "My legacy was built on loyalty. Tell the Iron Guard, the veterans Lyra discarded, that the captain is calling in his markers. I don't need a rescue, Marcus. I need an army at the Legacy Gala in 6 days. And I need you to find the medical records of the doctor who signed my commitment papers. Follow the money. Every man has a price, and I'm willing to bet Lyra paid his and Thorne's untraceable blood money." As the days ticked down, Silas began to physically prepare for his return. He stopped hiding the fact that he was recovering. He stood in the center of his room, performing slow, agonizing squats, forcing his atrophied muscles to remember their strength. He used the tension of the bedsheets to create a makeshift resistance band, pulling until his veins popped and sweat soaked his gray tunic. The nurses and Dr. Eris noticed a change, but they misread it. They saw a patient who was becoming active and agitated, a common symptom of late-stage dementia in their textbooks. They increased his dosage, but Elias, the janitor, was there to ensure the pills were swapped for sugar placebos he had scavenged. "They're moving the gala to the estate," Elias whispered through the slot on the 5th night. "The press is invited. They're calling it the changing of the guard. They're going to announce your permanent retirement to the world, sir. They even hired a pianist to play your favorite Chopin piece while they signed the final dissolution papers." Silas felt a cold, sharp laughter bubble in his chest. Chopin. How poetic. A funeral march for a man who hasn't died yet. On the final night before the gala, Silas executed the most dangerous part of his plan, the architect's strike. He didn't just freeze Lyra's accounts. He rerouted the entire Vane automated tracking system to a private, encrypted server he had hidden in a disused lighthouse in Cornwall. Suddenly, every Vane ship on the planet vanished from Lyra's screens. To the global markets, it looked like the Vane Empire had blinked out of existence. Panicked, Lyra would be forced to use the manual override at the estate, a physical console Silas had installed in his private study years ago. He knew she would go there. He knew she would be desperate to fix the glitch before the investors arrived. And he knew that the manual override required a biometric scan that her stolen papers couldn't faking. It required the hand of the founder. Silas sat on his bed, the tablet finally dead, its battery exhausted. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, but steady. The stroke had tried to silence him, and his daughter had tried to erase him. But they had both underestimated the sheer, stubborn will of the man who had built an empire from a single rowing boat. "Tomorrow, Lyra," he said to the shadows. "Tomorrow, the ocean comes for you." The Vane estate was a fortress of glass and steel perched precariously on a cliffside overlooking the churning Atlantic, a monument to the very ego Silas had cultivated for decades. Tonight, it was ablaze with light, a beacon for the global elite who had traveled through a storm to witness the transition of an empire. Inside the grand ballroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of cold champagne. A self-playing grand piano filled the space with a haunting rendition of a Chopin nocturne, providing a sophisticated backdrop to what Silas knew was a public execution. Lyra moved through the crowd like a queen who had already been crowned. She wore a gown of midnight silk that shimmered like oil on water, her face a mask of poise and practiced grief. By her side, Victor Thorne stood tall, his silver hair catching the light as he accepted handshakes from men who had spat on his name 10 years ago. They were the perfect image of a new era, vibrant, ruthless, and victorious. But Silas, watching through the hijacked feed of a hidden security camera in the ceiling, saw the subtle tremor in Lyra's hand as she reached for a glass. She was nervous. The ghost keys were working. Her empire was blind. In the center of the ballroom, a large mahogany desk had been set up, looking like an altar. On it sat the final dissolution papers of Vane Shipping and the founding charter of Thorn Vane International. All they needed was the final executive override code, the one Lyra assumed she had secured when she forced Silas to sign the power of attorney in the hospital. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor Thorne's voice boomed, cutting through the music. The room fell into a respectful silence. 30 years ago, a man tried to erase the Thorn name from the ledger of history. He thought that by taking my ships, he could take my future. But he made a fatal mistake. He forgot that a legacy isn't built on steel hulls, it's built on blood. And today, my daughter has brought that legacy home. He looked at Lyra with a pride that made Silas's stomach turn. It was a mirror of the look Silas had given her 1,000 times, now twisted and stolen. "Before we sign these documents," Lyra stepped forward, her voice amplified by the room's hidden speakers. "We would like to offer a moment of reflection for Silas Vane. Though his mind has unfortunately succumbed to the shadows of age, his work provides the foundation for our future. To Silas." She raised her glass, and the room followed suit. It was a toast to a dead man who was still breathing. Just as the glasses reached their lips, the massive high-definition screens lining the ballroom, originally meant to display the new Thorn Vane logo, exploded into static. A high-pitched electronic whine tore through the room, causing the guests to wince and cover their ears. The digital heartbeat of the house began to pulse in a violent, rhythmic red. When the static cleared, the image that appeared was not a logo. It was a live feed from a sterile, white room. Silas Vane sat in the center of the frame. He wasn't in a hospital gown. He was wearing his signature charcoal suit, his silver hair swept back, his eyes as sharp and cold as the ocean outside. He looked like a man who had just stepped out of a boardroom, not an asylum. "The problem with building a fortress out of glass, Lyra," Silas's voice echoed through the ballroom, deeper and more resonant than it had been in years, "is that eventually the sun comes out. And then everyone can see exactly what's happening inside." The silence that followed was absolute. Lyra's glass shattered on the marble floor, the champagne spraying her silk hem like blood. Victor Thorne's face turned a bruised shade of purple. "Father," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking. "I am not your father, Lyra. You made that very clear in the hospital," Silas said, his gaze fixed on the camera. "And you, Victor, you spent 30 years hiding in the dark, waiting for a stroke to do the work you were too weak to do yourself. You didn't come for my empire. You came for my leftovers. Shut it down." Victor roared at the technical staff. "Cut the power. Get that madman off the screen." "The power is mine, Victor," Silas countered calmly. "I designed the electrical grid for this estate. I designed the server architecture for the Grey Oaks facility. And I designed the digital backdoor that just finished uploading your offshore transaction history to the federal prosecutor's office 5 minutes ago." On the screens behind Silas, documents began to scroll at high speed. Records of the $3 million bribe paid to Dr. Eris. Encrypted emails between Lyra and Thorn discussing the permanent disposal of Silas Vane. Wire transfers from Vane Shipping's pension fund to Thorn's illegal smuggling accounts in Panama. The guests, the investors, the partners, the press, gasped as they realized they weren't at a gala, they were at a crime scene. Phones were pulled out. Cameras began to flash. The prestige of the night vanished in an instant, replaced by the frenzied energy of a feeding bird. "You think you're a predator, Lyra," Silas continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "But a predator knows when the wind changes. You were so busy looking at the crown that you didn't notice the floor was being removed beneath your feet." Lyra scrambled toward the mahogany desk, grabbing the manual override console. She slammed her palm onto the scanner, trying to kill the feed, trying to lock the doors. "Access denied," the house's voice announced. "Biometric signature, unauthorized. It requires the hand of the founder, Lyra," Silas said, a small, grim smile touching his lips. "And as you told me, I'm not going anywhere." The grand oak doors of the ballroom burst open. It wasn't the security team Lyra had hired. It was Marcus Reed, backed by a phalanx of federal agents in tactical gear. Behind them stood a dozen of Silas's old ship captains, men in their 60s and 70s, their faces grim and loyal. They hadn't come for the champagne. They had come for their captain. Lyra Vane, Victor Thorne, Elena Vane. Marcus's voice rang out over the chaos. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and multinational financial fraud. As the agents moved in, Victor Thorne tried to bolt toward the balcony, but he was blocked by two of Silas's veteran engineers, men he had once tried to ruin. They didn't move an inch. Lyra stood frozen by the desk, her steel orchid persona finally wilting into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the screen, at the man she had tried to erase. Silas, please, she sobbed. You taught me that there are no victims, only architects, Silas said, his eyes devoid of mercy. You built this moment, Lyra. Every lie, every bribe, every cold-hearted word. This is your design. I'm just the one making sure it stands. As the handcuffs clicked into place around Lyra's wrists, Silas reached forward and touched the camera lens. The screen went black. In the sudden darkness of the ballroom, only the red emergency lights remained, pulsing like a dying heart. The music had stopped. The Empire had been saved, but the family was gone. Silas Vane sat in his room at the Grey Oaks, watching the sunrise over the Atlantic through the door Marcus had just opened for him. He was a king again, but as he stood up to walk out into the cold morning air, he realized that the most expensive thing he had ever built was the wall he had finally put between himself and the people he once loved. The gala was over. The boarding party had won, and Silas Vane was finally, truly, alone. The dust of the scandal settled over the Vane estate like ash after a forest fire. Within 48 hours, the Legacy Gala had transitioned from a victory celebration for Victor Thorne into the centerpiece of a federal investigation. The headlines were relentless, detailing the Siren's betrayal and the return of the ghost captain. But for Silas Vane, the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a heavy, cold stillness. 3 days after the arrests, Silas stood on the mahogany deck of the Vane Sovereign, his personal flagship. The ship was docked at the private pier of his estate, its massive hull gently rocking against the rhythm of the Atlantic. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and pale gold. Silas leaned against the railing, his hands, once weak and trembling in a hospital bed, now gripped the cold steel with a steady, quiet strength. He was no longer Subject 402. He was no longer a patient. He was a man who had reclaimed his kingdom, but the kingdom was empty. Marcus Reed stepped onto the deck, his footsteps echoing on the wood. He stood a respectful distance behind Silas, holding a thick leather folder. The auditors have finished, Silas. Thorne's shell companies have been frozen. We've recovered 80% of the diverted funds. The fleet is back under our transponder codes. The board has voted unanimously to reinstate you as chairman emeritus with full veto power. Silas didn't turn around. He watched a lone seagull fight against the wind. And the others? Marcus hesitated. Victor Thorne and Elena are being held without bail. The evidence of medical bribery was too damning. As for Lyra, he paused, searching for the right words. She's in the state penitentiary's medical wing. Her lawyers are trying to plead temporary insanity due to immense corporate pressure, but the recording you made in the boardroom, it's ironclad, Silas. She won't be coming out for a long time. A sharp, cold pang went through Silas's chest. He remembered Lyra as a child, her small hand tucked into his as they walked through the shipyards. He had taught her to be ruthless because he thought the world was a cruel place that would swallow her whole if she weren't. He had built a monster to protect his daughter, only to have that monster turn its teeth toward him. She was my finest work, Marcus, Silas said, his voice barely a whisper against the wind. And my greatest failure. You didn't write her soul, Silas, Marcus said firmly. You just gave her the pen. She chose what to write with it. Silas finally turned, his face etched with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. I spent 70 years building things I thought would last forever. Steel hulls, concrete towers, digital empires. I thought if I controlled the variables, I could control the outcome. But life isn't an architectural blueprint. It's the ocean. It's chaotic, it's indifferent, and it eventually erodes everything. He took the leather folder from Marcus, but didn't open it. Instead, he looked at the house on the cliff. It looked smaller now, stripped of its mythic status. It was just a building, a collection of glass and stone that had housed a lie for 30 years. "What now, Captain?" Marcus asked. Silas looked out at the horizon. "I'm liquidating the estate. The house, the private jets, the art collection. Everything goes into a trust. Not for me, and certainly not for any heirs. It's going to the merchant mariners' pension funds and the families of the men who died on Vane's ships over the last 40 years. I've taken enough from the sea. It's time I gave something back." "And the company?" "The company will be restructured as an employee-owned conglomerate," Silas said, a spark of his old authority returning to his eyes. "I'll oversee the transition for a year. I want to make sure the next generation of captains doesn't have to worry about being sold out by their own boardrooms. After that, I think I'd like to see what the world looks like from a boat that doesn't have a boardroom on it." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Silas walked to the stern of the ship. He pulled a small, crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. It was the DNA test Lyra had taunted him with in the hospital, the proof that she wasn't his blood. He had carried it with him since the night of the gala, a heavy weight in his suit jacket. He looked at the results one last time. It didn't matter anymore. Blood was just a biological fact, but loyalty was a choice. Victor Thorne had provided the DNA, but Silas had provided the life. In the end, they had both lost her to the very ruthlessness they had cherished. Silas didn't tear the paper. He didn't burn it out of anger. He simply let it go. The wind caught the white slip, dancing it over the water before a wave rose up and swallowed it whole. It was a silent burial for a 30-year-old ghost. He felt a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time in his life, he wasn't planning 3 moves ahead. He wasn't calculating risks or measuring rivals. He was just a man standing on a deck, feeling the spray of the salt on his face. He walked back toward the bridge, his steps steady and purposeful. He passed the infirmary where he had once been a prisoner of his own nerves, and the office where he had once played God with global trade. He realized that the fortress of betrayal hadn't just been the house on the cliff or the asylum. It had been the walls he had built around his own heart to keep the world out. The truth had destroyed his family, but it had saved his soul. "Marcus," Silas called out as he reached the cabin door. "Yes, sir." "Set a course for the open water," Silas said, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. "I want to see the stars tonight without the city lights getting in the way." As the Vane sovereign slowly detached from the pier, the lights of the estate faded into the distance. The man who had spent his life building empires was finally sailing away from them. He was 70 years old, he was alone, and he had lost almost everything he thought he valued. But as the ship hit the first swell of the deep Atlantic, Silas Vane took a deep, clear breath of the cold air and realized that for the first time in his life, he was finally the master of his own soul. The fortress had fallen, but the foundation, the hard, unyielding truth, remained. And on that foundation, he would spend the rest of his days building something that didn't need walls to survive. He was the captain, and for the first time, he knew exactly where he was going.